Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the world of Queen Elizabeth I. And it's not the glittering world of jewels and golden gowns you're imagining. No, tonight you're stepping into a palace where the air itself feels heavy with human stench. Old food and clouds of perfume desperately trying to hold the rot at bay. The walls echo with music, laughter, and whispers of political intrigue. But underneath it all, there's a smell that no poet can describe without gagging. You probably won't survive this tour without pinching your nose or at least wrinkling it until it aches. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I love seeing who's listening in their midnight cocoon and who's tuning in with the morning light. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move through the palace halls. The first thing you notice is not the tapestries or the glitter of jewels, but the simple fact that the air makes your eyes water. Perfumes, sweet roses, sharp musk, even hints of cinnamon float thick in the atmosphere. But they don't erase the deeper reality. Behind the scents is sweat, stale food, damp wool, and unwashed bodies pressed together in a place where hundreds of courtiers jostle for attention. Imagine the worst locker room you've ever stepped into, then multiply it by velvet gowns, heavy wigs, and months without soap. That's your welcome to Elizabeth's court. The Queen herself glides by, dazzling in a gown stiff with embroidery, her neck glittering with pearls. From a distance, she seems divine, almost untouchable. But as she passes, the fragrance she carries doesn't just smell of rosette, has that cloying thickness of oils, trying desperately to mask something deeper, like a bathroom sprayed with too much air freshener after an incident. Historians still argue whether the courtiers themselves grew used to this background stench, or if they too wrinkled their noses and simply pretended not to notice as you linger. You catch sight of servants scattering fresh rushes on the floor along. Grass is strewn to hide the dirt and absorb moisture. At first, it looks quaint, almost rustic. But soon you notice what the rushes are covering. Food scraps mashed into the floor, spilled ale, urine from chamber pots emptied without warning. The rushes don't clean nids, more like shaking glitter onto a mess and hoping no one sees. And yet, this was considered perfectly respectable. To Elizabeth's courtiers, the palace was polished, even enviable. To you, it feels like walking barefoot across the world's worst compost heap. You overhear whispers of how rarely water touches the Queen's skin. Once a month, maybe, she'll submit to a bath, and even then, only because it's thought to be necessary. Most days, her attendants wipe her with linen cloths and sprinkle her body with scented powders. Doctors of her time warn that water can open the pores and invite disease straight into the bloodstream. So instead of cleansing, they sealed their sweat and grime beneath layers of fabric and fragrance. Imagine a society where a hot shower would have been considered life-threatening. That was Elizabethan England. Even more curious are the sweet-smelling pomanders dangling from noble waists. These little balls of silver or gold, filled with herbs and spices, swing gently as courtiers walk by, their scent fighting valiantly against the tide. Some are filled with rosemary, cloves, or even dried orange peel. Others contain musk scraped from animals or the pungent resins of far-off trees. To you, it feels like being trapped in the world's most overstocked candle shop. Except the candles can't quite extinguish the garbage smell leaking through. The Queen's courtiers whisper of her dazzling beauty, her alabaster complexion, her commanding voice. Yet you can't stop noticing how every compliment is paired with a cloud of perfume so thick it makes you sneeze. You think back to your own time, where deodorant aisles in the supermarket promise fresh confidence. Here, no such modern miracle exists. Here, perfume is not an accessory, it's survival. The last thin veil between courtly glamour and reality. Of course, Elizabeth wasn't unique in this. All across Europe, kings, queens, dukes, and duchesses lived in the same cloud of sweet rot. Historians debate whether Elizabeth's court was cleaner or dirtier than, say, the French court. One French ambassador, clearly unimpressed, claimed that England's queen smelled of roses until she spoke too near. That little quip has lived on for centuries. A reminder that beneath the pearls and political power, Elizabeth I was as human and as smelly as the rest, and while perfumes filled the air, incense and candles did their part too. Every great hall burned beeswax or tallow, their smoke sticking to gowns and wigs. The sweet scent of beeswax could soften the stench, but the cheaper animal fat candles, they smelled like cooked meat, mixed with the already rich bouquet of sweat and waste. You imagine dining beneath chandeliers of flaming tallow, the flickering light making the jewels sparkle, even as the smell makes your stomach churn. Still, for Elizabeth, this was the stage of majesty. Smells were simply part of the costume. No, more troubling than the tight corset or the lead-heavy crown. When you live in a world where nobody bathes and everybody reeks, your nose adapts, doesn't it? Well, maybe. You try to tell yourself that. But as you shuffle deeper into the palace, you can't help pinching your nose just a little tighter. And yet, here's the curious thing. While we shudder today at the thought of such filth, Elizabeth's courtiers marveled at her elegance. They weren't revolted, they were awestruck. The queen's perfumes, her gowns, her carefully managed appearances distracted them. Just as they're distracting you now? Beneath the smells and grime, there was still majesty, still awe, still power. Which makes you wonder, maybe the real trick of Elizabeth's court wasn't scrubbing away the dirt. Maybe it was convincing everyone to look and smell the other way. You shuffle further into the palace corridors, still gagging slightly at the heavy perfume mixed with sweat, when one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting whispers something that makes you blink. The queen, she says, with a casual air, only takes a full bath once a month. You nearly choke on the air, because here you are in a palace dripping with jewels and gold. Yet its ruler is as squeamish about water as a cat. The truth is that bathing, in Elizabeth's time, carried more superstition than cleanliness. Doctors warned constantly that hot water opened the pores, letting disease seep straight into the body. To them, water was not refreshing, it was a dangerous liquid invitation for plague. So, rather than relaxing in a tub the way you might after a long day, Elizabeth's court treated bathing like a risky medical experiment. When she did climb into her wooden tub, it was carefully arranged with cloths, herbs, and sometimes even slices of citrus to protect her delicate royal flesh from sickness. Historians still argue whether she actually believed in these dangers or whether it was just tradition she followed for appearances. The queen's once-a-month bath soon became the stuff of rumor, repeated across Europe with equal parts shock and judgment. Some claim she said she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Whether that's true or just gossip, the idea stuck, because it perfectly matches the Elizabethan idea of hygiene. Little contact with water, lots of fabric, and endless clouds of perfume. You picture the moment, Elizabeth sitting regally in her tub, servants carrying buckets of warm water fetched from fires, carefully poured so as not to shock her system. Her pale skin gleams against the wooden rim, her hair pinned away from the dampness. And yet the bath itself isn't long, nor is it soapy. Soap, made of harsh lye, was often avoided because it stripped the skin raw. Instead, herbs, oils, or even just warm water served as the cleaning method. You can almost smell the rosemary and lavender rising with the steam, but also the faint reminder that this was the first wash in weeks, when she wasn't bathing. The queen relied on dry cleaning, no, not the kind where you drop off your suit at the local cleaners, but the Elizabethan version. Servants rubbed her body with linen cloths, dabbing away sweat and oils, then sprinkling scented powders to mask any lingering odor. Imagine a spa treatment where the masseuse skips the water entirely, hands you a cloud of talc, and calls it a day. It doesn't sound especially refreshing, does it? Meanwhile, the courtiers around her were even less committed to water. Many avoided bathing altogether, preferring to wear layers of linen shirts, which they believed absorbed dirt from the body. Changing your undershirt, in their minds, equaled cleaning yourself. You glance around at the nobles shifting in their stiff velvet gowns and realize most of them probably haven't bathed since last season. Suddenly, the Queen's once-a-month plunge seems downright progressive. Of course, there were exceptions. Some travelers and foreign dignitaries described private bathhouses in England, though their reputation was dubious. Many had become associated with illicit activities, making them less places of hygiene and more dens of scandal. So public bathing culture, once common in medieval Europe, had all but vanished by Elizabeth's reign. Instead of steamy bathhouses, you get a few nervous soaks and a whole lot of linen rubbing. The irony is that Elizabeth herself loved to appear dazzling, immaculate, untouchable. Her white gowns, her shimmering jewels, her carefully painted face gave the impression of pristine perfection. But under those layers, a body that had been touched by water perhaps 12 times a year. You can't help but imagine how it must have felt for her closest attendants, leaning in to lace her bodice or adjust her ruff, breathing in the real scent behind the glamour. And yet, here's where the gentle joke sneaks in. In a court where no one bathed regularly, Elizabeth may have actually smelled better than most. The lady you pass in the hallway, with her hair powdered but her underarms untouched by water for months, might make the Queen smell positively fresh by comparison. You think about your own world, where missing a shower by one day feels like an emergency, and you laugh softly. In Elizabeth's England, you'd be considered squeaky clean. The servants whisper among themselves, proud of their mistress's careful habits. To them, bathing once a month is discipline, a sign of balance, not neglect. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth might have bathed more often in private, with her closest attendants sworn to secrecy. But the famous story stuck, once a month, and never more, as you imagine Elizabeth drying herself with soft linen. Stepping into a freshly perfumed gown, you realize that this ritual wasn't just hygiene, it was ceremony. Water was precious, risky, and almost sacred. So, the act of bathing wasn't about everyday cleanliness, it was about marking time, about starting anew in a world where filth was constant. More than anything, explains why Elizabeth could glow like a goddess while secretly smelling like, well, a person who hadn't touched water since last moon. You wander deeper into Elizabeth's private chambers, and the air seems heavier, almost syrupy. Like you've stepped into the perfume section of a department store where someone opened every single bottle at once. Perfume isn't just an accessory, here it's survival. The Queen and her courtiers live in an atmosphere constantly pumped full of rosewater, musk, and strange mixtures of herbs, all trying desperately to mask the fact that no one has bathed recently. Servants dart about with little glass bottles, sprinkling scented waters on the Queen's linen, on her gowns, even on her hairpieces. You watch as a maid spritzes her with rose oil before she steps into a hall, and for a fleeting second the scent is pleasant. But the perfume quickly collides with the stale odor of unwashed skin beneath layers of fabric, and suddenly the room feels less like roses and more like roses buried under a compost heap. You probably won't survive this nose assault unless you start breathing through your mouth. Elizabeth herself had an enormous collection of scents. Some were distilled from flowers like lavender and jasmine, others from exotic spices carried to England on trading ships. The most prized perfumes contained musks craped from the glands of Duror civet, secreted from wildcats. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth preferred floral sweetness or animalic depth. But all accounts agree she wore enough perfume to cloud any room she entered. It wasn't subtle. It was an olfactory declaration of power. And perfumes weren't just sprayed on the skin. They were woven into the very fabric of daily life. Gloves were soaked in ambergris, a waxy substance that washed up from sperm whales and smelled strangely sweet. Fans were brushed with scented oils so that every delicate wave spread both breeze and fragrance. Even prayer books had pages dabbed with rosewater, so devotion carried its own perfume. You picture Elizabeth raising her perfumed glove to her face, the scent both intoxicating and necessary to ward off the reality around her. But as pleasant as perfumes could be, the courtiers sometimes joked about how suffocating the palace air became. Imagine hundreds of nobles each carrying their own mix of herbs, resins, and oils, all blending into one giant clash of smells. Some favored sharp cinnamon, others smoky frankincense, others pungent animal musks. The result was less like a harmonious bouquet and more like an uncoordinated perfume flash mob. You wonder whether courtiers ever left the palace just to sniff. Fresh air again, the way you step outside after someone sprays too much body spray in a high school locker room. One quirky tidbit lingers in your mind: the use of pomanders, those little metal orbs filled with herbs or perfumes, worn at the waist or around the neck. Courtiers believed pomanders warded off plague since they thought disease traveled through bad air. So people carried miniature perfume grenades wherever they went, opening them to sniff during moments of fear. Elizabeth herself owned several, made of gold and silver, their filigree patterns releasing fragrance as she walked. To her, the pomander wasn't just a pretty ornament, it was a shield against invisible enemies. Of course, whether perfumes actually protected anyone is still debated. Historians argue that while scented herbs might have repelled lice or fleas, they did nothing against the real causes of plague. But in a world that didn't understand germs, the act of perfuming felt like science. It gave courtiers control, or at least the illusion of it, in a palace that otherwise reeked. And you can't help but smirk at the irony. The more perfumes they used, the more they revealed what they were trying to hide. You only spray deodorant. When you're worried about odor, right? Multiply that by gallons of rosewater and ambergris, and you've got a court constantly announcing, "Yes, we smell bad, please don't notice." It's like spraying a whole can of air freshener in a bathroom and pretending nothing happened. Even Elizabeth's makeup carried its own scent. Venetian ceruse, the lead-based paste she smeared on her face, was often mixed with vinegar or floral oils. So her painted complexion didn't just look ghostly white, teeth smelled faintly acidic, like someone had combined roses with pickling fluid. Imagine leaning in for a royal kiss on the cheek and getting hit with that cocktail of vinegar and flowers. Courtiers probably smiled through the experience, while secretly fighting the urge to cough. And perfumes weren't just about hiding filth, they were about projecting wealth. Spices, resins, and exotic oils cost a fortune. To smell of frankincense was to announce your trade routes, your access to the far reaches of the world. Elizabeth's entire image depended on being untouchable, heavenly, larger than life. Perfume made that illusion possible. To smell like roses, even when your teeth were rotting and your gowns were unwashed, was the ultimate royal trick. You lean back against a pillar, dizzy from the cloud of competing scents, and you can't help but laugh. If you time-traveled here with a bottle of modern body spray, the courtiers might faint in admiration, thinking you carried the essence of paradise. Meanwhile, you'd probably just want to open a window and beg for Febreze, and yet, through all the heavy perfume, Elizabeth shines. The smell is part of her, as much as the ruff around her neck or the crown on her head. She is the Virgin Queen, and her scent, however overwhelming, is carefully crafted to remind everyone of her divine presence. Even if your lungs feel like they might collapse, you have to admit, she knows how to stage an entrance. You edge closer to the queen as she takes her seat. And the first thing you notice, if you dare to lean near, enoughs her smile. At a distance, it sparkles beneath the glow of candlelight, framed by her pale painted face and ruby lips. But when you see it up close, the glitter fades into something darker. Elizabeth's teeth are blackened, some missing entirely, others so rotten they tilt like broken fence posts. Suddenly, that dazzling royal grin feels less like a symbol of majesty and more like a dental horror story. The truth is, sugar was both her greatest pleasure and her slow undoing. Elizabeth adored sweet sugar pastes, candied fruits, marzipan, creations molded into elaborate shapes. Banquets at court included entire sugar sculptures. Castles and ships carved from the crystalline stuff, which the queen delighted in nibbling. To her, sugar was the taste of wealth and sophistication. But to her teeth, it was a steady, relentless acid bath. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth ate more sugar than her contemporaries, or if her teeth simply decayed more visibly because she lived so long. Either way, her mouth became a battlefield where indulgence met early dentistry, and the sweets won. Foreign visitors often noted the shocking state of English teeth. One diplomat observed that the Queen's teeth were black, a fault the English seemed to have from their great use of sugar. That's right, her courtiers, eager to mimic her habits, also ended up proudly sporting rows of rotted teeth. Imagine people today bragging about their cavities because their favorite celebrity had them. In a strange way, Elizabeth turned dental. Disaster into a trend, but the Queen's dental struggles weren't just cosmetic. They caused her immense pain. Accounts mention her suffering from aching gums and decayed molars. When she smiled, some courtiers whispered, her breath carried a stench that perfume could never fully mask. You imagine leaning close to hear her speak, struck by her charisma, only to be hit with a wave of sour, decaying odor. It's like admiring a bouquet of roses, then realizing there's a dead rat tucked inside. The remedies were, frankly, worse than the disease. Elizabeth's attendants tried to help with herbal concoctions, tooth powders made from soot or crushed eggshells, even rinses of wine or vinegar. One recipe called for grinding burnt rosemary and mixing it with salt scrub that across your gums, and you'd certainly feel something, though probably not relief. Another involved rubbing the teeth with honey, which sounds pleasant until you realize it only fed the bacteria gnawing deeper into the enamel. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth's physicians truly thought these treatments worked, or whether they were simply fumbling in the dark, hoping anything might dull the Queen's suffering. In moments of severe agony, there was only one solution: extraction. You shudder as you imagine the crude tool's iron forceps clamped onto a tooth. No anesthesia, no sterilization. The Queen, famously resistant to showing weakness, reportedly delayed extractions until the pain became unbearable. One story suggests that when an elderly bishop complained about having a tooth pulled, Elizabeth commanded it be yanked out in front of him, just to prove she could endure the same pain with greater courage. You picture her gripping the chair, her knuckles white, her crown steady, as the dentist wrenches out a rotten tooth. Blood, sweat, and regal dignity all mixed together in one grisly performance. And yet, she carried on smiling. That's the strangest part, despite the decay, despite the pain. Elizabeth's portraits often show her lips curved in serene composure, her teeth mostly hidden behind crimson paint. The artists, of course, flattered Herno. One was about to immortalize the Queen's dental nightmares in oil paint. Still, the reality lingered beneath the canvas, a monarch who ruled with blackened teeth but refused to let them dim her power. It's almost comedic when you think about it. Imagine Elizabeth hosting a foreign ambassador, dazzling in jewels and silks, every word dripping with wit and authority, while the poor ambassador tries not to gag at the smell. You can almost hear him writing home. Her Majesty is both majestic and rather pungent. But here's the fascinating twist. In Elizabeth's England, bad teeth eventually became a marker of status. Sugar was expensive, a luxury few could afford. To have blackened teeth was to show that you had indulged in the sweetest delicacies. Just like the Queen. In a way, decay became fashionable. The poor, with their plainer diets, often had healthier smiles. Yet they looked up at nobles with blackened mouths and thought, "Ah, now that's true refinement." It's like envying someone today for having the latest designer shoes even if the shoes are giving them terrible blisters. And you can't help but chuckle at the irony. Elizabeth, desperate to project eternal youth and beauty, inadvertently made dental rot part of her image. She wanted to be remembered as radiant, powerful, untouchable. Instead, she also became remembered as the Queen with the sugar-blackened teeth. And perhaps that's the most human thing about her. For all her crowns and titles, she couldn't outrule tooth decay. So as you sit back and imagine the Queen biting into another candied fig, smiling through the pain, you realize that beneath the regal veneer, she shared the same weakness as everyone else's sweet tooth that betrayed her. You stay close as the Queen excuses herself from the Great Hall, her jeweled skirts whispering against the filthy rushes, and a lady-in-waiting mutters something about her tooth again. You follow into her private chambers, and there, away from the ceremony, Elizabeth's legendary glamour flickers. She is not the dazzling Virgin Queen in this moment. She is a woman wincing, pressing her jaw, desperate for relief from another TOOTHA. Her attendants rush forward with a tray of remedies. And here's where things get both fascinating and a little absurd. One servant mixes a paste of soot and crushed eggshells, dabbing it onto her gums as though dark powder could somehow calm throbbing pain. Another readies a rinse of red wine, mixed with vinegar, which Elizabeth swirls and spits into a silver bowl. You can almost hear her grimace as the sour liquid burns her swollen gums. Historians still argue whether these treatments brought even a moment of relief, or whether they were more ritual than medicine. There are other remedies too, stranger and more desperate. A concoction of ground sage leaves boiled in ale. A paste of honey and burnt salt rubbed onto the aching tooth with a finger wrapped in linen. Some even claimed that holding a live frog against your cheek could draw out the pain. You stifle a laugh at the image. The Queen of England, supreme ruler of a vast empire, sitting stiffly while a servant presses a squirming frog to her royal face. It sounds ridiculous, but desperation makes people try anything. And toothache in the 16th century was no joke. Of course, when the pain became unbearable, there was always extraction. The tools were crude iron forceps, sometimes heated in fire, to sterilize them, sometimes not. No anesthesia, no numbing gel, just a prayer and a steady hand. You imagine the Queen gripping the arms of her chair, her painted nails digging into the wood, her wig tilting as she clenches against the inevitable yank. One sharp crack, a scream muffled into her sleeve, and the tooth was gone. Relief mixed with blood, leaving her drained but victorious. Elizabeth prided herself on endurance, and it's said she sometimes ordered such extractions to be done publicly, so no one could accuse her of weakness. But the suffering didn't end with the tooth itself. Infection was a constant risk. Mouths in Elizabeth's time were playgrounds for bacteria, and pulling one rotten tooth often left the gums swollen, bleeding, or festering. Some courtiers whispered that her frequent headaches and fevers may have stemmed from these infections. Still, the Queen carried on, layering perfume, powders, and smiles over her pain, refusing to let anyone see just how human she was. The irony, of course, is that many of her courtiers shared the same fate. Sugar had crept into every noble household, and rotten teeth became a sign of privilege. So while Elizabeth suffered, she was far from alone. Courtiers compared remedies, traded recipes for herbal powders, and sometimes even plucked their own teeth as proof of bravery. Imagine a court where dental suffering was almost a badge of honor. Proof that you lived richly enough to rot from the inside out. Some physicians experimented with bizarre new ideas. One theory suggested rubbing dogs' teeth against the gums to strengthen a weak mouth. Another recommended stuffing cavities with clove oil and wax, a method that does sound faintly familiar to modern dentistry. Though without drills or fillings, the relief was temporary at best. You can picture Elizabeth sighing as her attendants dabbed these mixtures into her mouth, only for the pain to return by supper. And here's where the scholarly debates creep in. Some historians argue Elizabeth exaggerated her dental pain in her later years to avoid public speaking, while others insist the agony was genuine, worsened by decades of sugar indulgence. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. After all, portraits of her in her 60s still show a poised monarch. Lips painted into confident smiles, even as her teeth crumbled behind them. What's striking, though, is how she never abandoned her sweet tooth. Even knowing the damage it caused, Elizabeth continued to demand candied fruits, sugar loaves, and frosted pastries at her table. To her, sweets were not just indulgence, they were political theater. Serving mountains of sugar at banquets displayed wealth, trade power, and sophistication. And if she paid for that with a throbbing jaw, well, she would simply endure it. You imagine her biting into a sugar-dusted marchpane rose, wincing ever so slightly, then raising her chin with regal pride as though nothing were wrong. And here's your gentle joke of the evening. Somewhere in history's great banquet halls, there must have been a courtier watching the queen nibble her sugar paste, thinking, if Her Majesty can chew through the pain, surely I can too. And so, the entire court gritted their way through toothaches, united by both loyalty and cavities. You lean back and sigh, realizing that while today you can grab ibuprofen or book a dentist appointment, Elizabeth had only frogs, soot, and vinegar. And yet, she ruled with unshakable authority, even as her mouth betrayed her. It's a reminder that power doesn't erase, it just hides it better. You glance at Elizabeth again as she prepares for yet another grand appearance, and this time your eyes are drawn not to her teeth, but to her skin. At first glance, it gleams smooth, pale, almost glowing in the candlelight. Her face looks like porcelain, untouched by sun or blemish, and you almost believe the illusion of eternal youth she so carefully cultivates. But then you notice the thickness of it, the way the paint-like substance cracks slightly near her jawline. That alabaster glow is not nature's gifted chemistry, and not the good kind. The queen's signature look came from Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from lead carbonate mixed with vinegar. It promised a snow-white complexion, the fashionable beauty standard of the day, associated with purity, nobility, and divine authority. The whiter your skin, the more obvious it was that you never had to labor outdoors, but the cost of this artificial whiteness was staggering. Lead, as you know today, is poison, and Elizabeth was covering her skin with it daily. Historians still argue how much she knew about the risks. Some say she believed ceruse truly beautified her, others that she simply couldn't abandon the appearance once it became part of her legend. Either way, the results were devastating. Lead makeup slowly damaged the skin underneath, causing sores, thinning, and discoloration. To cover those new flaws, more ceruse was applied in a vicious cycle of paint and poison. Imagine slapping spackle onto a wall that's crumbling underneath, the cracks only deepen. But you keep piling it on, and the process wasn't delicate. Attendants smeared the paste thickly across her face, neck, and hands, drying it into a mask-like layer. Then they dusted her with starch or ground alabaster for an even paler finish. Rouge à fond made with mercury sulfide brightened her cheeks and lips, a poisonous cherry on top of the toxic sundae. You almost want to reach out with a makeup remover wipe, whispering, "Please, Your Majesty, for your own good." But no such product exists here. Only vinegar, breadcrumbs, or harsh abrasives to scrape the mask away at night. Removing the makeup was as damaging as wearing it. Strong lye-based washes or even rough cloths were used to rub it off, tearing the skin beneath. Some recipes called for mixtures of egg whites and alum to lift the paint, leaving the queen's face raw and vulnerable. Then, the next morning, the whole process started again. It's no wonder that Elizabeth became increasingly reclusive in her final years. Her real skin beneath the mask may have been mottled, scarred, or even sagging from decades of lead assault. There's even a quirky rumor that she sometimes used bread dough as a cosmetic sponge, patting it over her face to smooth out the paste. Imagine reaching for a loaf of bread, not to eat, but to dab your toxic makeup. It sounds like satire, but for Elizabeth, this was serious routine. In a way, her bread-handled ritual was as much armor as fashion. And yet, for all its dangers, the look worked. Portraits of Elizabeth immortalize her as the Virgin Queen, ageless, divine, and immaculate. Her ceruse mask became part of her mythology, a symbol of eternal virginity and heavenly authority. The pale glow told her people she was not just a woman, but something closer to a goddess. The irony is that beneath that celestial glow, her flesh may have been screaming. Historians still debate whether her death at age 69 was hastened by years of lead exposure. Symptoms like hair loss, tooth decay, and nervous tremors align eerily with lead poisoning. But without her body to study, the truth is elusive. What is certain is that the very substance that made her appear immortal was quietly killing her. You can't help but see the dark poetry in that, beauty masking decay, majesty hiding fragility, and here's where your sleepy chuckle comes in. Picture Elizabeth during a tense council meeting. Her advisors argue about war with Spain. There, voices rising. Elizabeth sits silent, pale as moonlight, her face unflinching. Then, with the faintest scratch of her nail, a flake of lead makeup drifts onto her ruff. The men hush instantly, not daring to mention it, while you, an invisible observer, want to lean in and whisper, "Ma'am, your face is peeling." It's both tragic and a little funny. The small absurdities behind such grandeur. The Queen's lead-painted visage shaped not just her lifetime, but the way we remember her. Ask anyone today to imagine Elizabeth I, and they'll likely picture the chalk-white face, the red lips, the golden hair. The poison mask became the crown she never took off. Even as her health suffered, even as her skin deteriorated, she clung to it, unwilling to let the world see her vulnerability. You sit back and breathe deeply, grateful for the softness of modern lotions and the mercy of safe cosmetics. Elizabeth's beauty routine reminds you that sometimes the price of perfection is far greater than the flaw it hides. And in her case, the price may have been her very life. You shift your focus away from the chalk-white mask of Elizabeth's face and wander closer to her personal quarters. There, under flickering candlelight, stands a wooden table cluttered with jars, bowls, and powders. It looks like the workshop of an alchemist rather than the boudoir of a queen. Strange smells cling to the air: vinegar, resin, herbs, and something sharp and metallic that stings your nose. Welcome to Elizabeth's version of a makeup counter. Only this one would horrify you more than the back aisle of a discount drugstore. The Queen's cosmetic shelf was no simple vanity. It was an arsenal of potions, powders, and questionable experiments. Among the staples, ground alabaster for smoothing, cinnabar for rouge, verdigris for green tints, and sulfur for treating blemishes. Mercury showed up in several concoctions. 2. Despite its tendency to cause tremors, madness, and eventual death. And of course, there were endless variations of perfumes, pomades, and oils, each carrying promises of youth, health, or irresistible charm. You probably picture a glamorous queen carefully dabbing perfume behind her ears. Instead, Elizabeth's attendants sometimes rubbed grease mixed with civet, a secretion from the anal glands of a small mammal, onto her skin to give a musky, exotic scent. Yes, you heard that correctly, civet. Musk was prized as luxurious. You might wrinkle your nose, but in a smoky Tudor court filled with sweat, smoke, and chamber pots, a strong animal musk was considered heavenly. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth was personally inventive with her cosmetics, or if she relied entirely on recipes from apothecaries. Some letters suggest she dabbled in mixing her own waters and lotions. Imagine the Queen of England bent over a mortar and pestle, grinding away like an amateur chemist, while her ladies-in-waiting prayed she wouldn't accidentally blow the roof off with mercury fumes. What makes this collection even stranger is the way it blurred medicine and makeup. In Tudor England, the line between healing and beautifying was paper-thin. A balm might soothe a rasher, double as a face paint. A perfume might mask body odor, or be inhaled as a supposed cure for plague. Elizabeth's cosmetics weren't just for vanity. They were believed to hold power over health, spirit, and even fate. And sometimes the recipes took a grotesque turn. One rumor claimed women of her court experimented with mixtures of crushed bird droppings and vinegar as skin treatments. Another whispered recipe included powdered toad as an ingredient for clearing blemishes. Imagine being told your acne solution involves a mashed amphibian. Suddenly a drugstore spot cream feels like a gift from heaven. Yet, to Elizabeth, these concoctions were part of her performance. Every powder was a layer of armor, every perfume a mask against the stench of mortality. The Virgin Queen was not just a ruler, but a symbol. And symbols cannot afford pimples or wrinkles. Here's your light chuckle moment. Picture Elizabeth holding a little jar labeled youth water, applying it carefully to her temples. She closes her eyes, certain it will keep her radiant. Meanwhile, you peek at the recipe list: vinegar, lead shavings, and a pinch of hog's lard. You almost want to tap her shoulder and say, "Your Majesty, that's not Sephiroth. That's a medieval prank." Still, there was artistry in these toxic paints. Her attendants blended, powdered, and layered with precision, creating the illusion of effortless beauty. It's the same trick influencers pull today, only with safer palettes. And like modern beauty culture, Elizabeth's world thrived on secrecy. Recipes were guarded, passed between nobles like state secrets, each mixture promising to erase time, hide flaws, and outshine rivals. But beneath the glamour lingered danger. Lead seeped into her bloodstream. Mercury poisoned her nerves. Animal fats went rancid in the summer heat. Each cosmetic was both salvation and slow betrayal. The Queen's collection was not a drawer of harmless powders, it was a cabinet of curiosities. Part pharmacy, part weapon, part coffin. And historians still puzzle over how much Elizabeth suffered from her choices. Did she feel constant headaches from mercury vapors? Did she notice her trembling hands, chalking it up to age? Or was she so accustomed to discomfort that it became invisible? The record leaves space for debate. But the suspicion remains. Her vanity table may have been her most dangerous battlefield. You glance again at that cluttered wooden surface, imagining the candlelight bouncing off jars of poison disguised as beauty aids. For Elizabeth, each jar was a ticket to eternity, a way to project divine purity to her subjects. For you, it's a reminder of just how far people will go to control the story. Their body tells, and as you watch her dab a final bit of rouge onto her lead-painted cheeks, you can't help but think, the Virgin Queen wasn't just ruling England, she was fighting a silent war against time. Armed with the strangest, smelliest, and deadliest arsenal of cosmetics history ever concocted, you leave the table of powders and perfumes behind and drift toward the softer glow of Elizabeth's private chambers. The air here is still heavy, but now it carries a different note: wax, dust, and the faint odor of hair oils gone slightly rancid. You notice her elaborate red wig perched on a stand like a silent sentry in the corner. It looks glorious at a distance, thick, curled, shimmering with ribbons and jewels. But you step closer and see what history books politely call ingenious craftsmanship and what you might simply call a nightmare toupee. Elizabeth didn't just wear wigs, she lived in them. By the time she was in her 30s, her natural hair was thinning, dulled, and brittle from endless treatments. That was a problem, because her auburn locks had once been her trademark, a fiery symbol of Tudor power. Losing them was not just vanity, was politics. To appear weak or aged could unravel her myth. So wigs became her crown beneath the crown. And oh, the wigs were works of art. They were made from human hair, animal hair, or sometimes a blend of both. Imagine the Queen's ladies brushing horsehair and weaving it into curls that would later sit upon the head of the most powerful woman. In Europe, it's almost too absurd. Like discovering your favorite celebrity extensions came straight from a barn. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's massive wig collection was meant more for fashion than necessity, or if baldness had already set in so dramatically that she had no choice. Some sources claim she owned over 80 wigs, each styled for specific occasions. Others think the number is exaggerated. But one thing is certain: her wigs were central to her carefully controlled image. The problem, of course, was cleanliness. Wigs in the 1500s were not washed like modern synthetic pieces. At best, they were brushed, powdered, and perfumed. At worst, they became breeding grounds for lice. You can almost hear the faint scratching sound as tiny intruders set up camp. In those carefully curled locks, no matter how many herbs or powders attendants sprinkled in, the infestation always came back. One fringe detail whispers that wigs were sometimes lined with strips of cloth soaked in vinegar, meant to deter vermin. Did it work? Only halfway. The lice seemed happy to adapt. So Elizabeth's attendants had to pick through her wigs, combing and plucking. A royal version of nitpicking that probably stretched into hours. Here's your small laugh. Imagine Elizabeth, seated like a stoic monarch, wig slightly askew, while 3 ladies-in-waiting circle her head with tiny combs, each muttering about the Queen's lice moving faster than ours. Court life suddenly doesn't sound so glamorous, does it? But wigs weren't only practical, they were symbols. By layering her wigs with jewels, pearls, and golden threads, Elizabeth created an almost supernatural aura. Her hair wasn't just hair, it was a halo, a flame, a crown within a crown. To her subjects, she looked timeless. To you, peeking into her private space, you see the trick. Beneath the flame-red curls was brittle, patchy hair and a scalp probably irritated from years of harsh treatments. Historians debate whether Elizabeth's vanity in wigs was typical of noble women or uniquely obsessive. Plenty of women wore false hair, but few wielded it so politically. When she appeared before Parliament or ambassadors, the wig was as important as the speech. It was theater, and she was the actress who never broke character. And yet, behind closed doors, imagine the discomfort. Wigs were heavy, itchy, and hot. Combined with candlelit rooms, stiff corsets, and layers of gowns, wearing one all day was exhausting. You picture Elizabeth sighing as she finally pulled one off at night, the relief as sudden as removing tight shoes after a long day. Maybe she rubbed her sore scalp and muttered, "Finally," before handing it to a waiting attendant. The moment was human, fragile, hidden from the world. Stranger still, Some records suggest wigs were perfumed with mixtures of rosewater, cloves, or even ambergris, a waxy substance from the stomachs of whales. Yes, a whale's digestive oddities could end up dabbed into the queen's hairpiece. That's luxury Tudor style, laced with pearls on the outside, stuffed with well-vomit perfume on the inside. But the wigs did their job. To her people, Elizabeth appeared unchanging, eternal. Her image on coins, portraits, and processions always showed that fiery halo, the illusion of eternal youth. You see now how wigs weren't just disguises, they were instruments of power, each curl carrying the weight of empire. And yet the more you study them, the more unsettling they become. The thought of crawling lice, of sweat soaking into horsehair, of heavy jewels tugging on already fragile roots. It's enough to make your scalp itch in sympathy. Elizabeth lived in a world where appearances were survival. Her wigs were more than fashion, they were lifelines. And as you back away from the red mane gleaming in the corner of her chamber, you realize that every strand tells the same story. Beneath the dazzling illusion was a woman desperately holding back time, one itchy wig at a time. You linger in the Queen's chamber, but your attention drifts toward the carved wooden screens and embroidered hangings. Behind them lies something more intimate than wigs or powders, her wardrobe. At first glance, it's magnificent, shimmering. Silks, stiff brocades, shimmering velvets, gowns stitched with pearls and threads of gold. The colors strike you immediately: crimson, emerald, midnight black. They look glorious, but the closer you move, the more unsettling the truth becomes. The sheer weight of Elizabeth's clothing was astonishing. A single ceremonial gown could weigh 40 pounds, layered with stiffened fabrics and lined with furs. You picture yourself stepping into one, and your shoulders ache just imagining it. Now add a rough-thaw stiff lace collar, reaching almost to her ears, starched so hard it could stand on its own. The ruff alone was a neck brace of discomfort. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's elaborate wardrobe was primarily a political weapon showing majesty to keep rivals at bay, or whether it was also a personal obsession. Suggests both. She used clothing like armor, yet she also hoarded it. Records reveal hundreds of gowns in her possession, yet she almost never wore the same one twice in public. Imagine the laundry nightmare if laundry had been possible. Here comes the horror. Those gowns were rarely washed. Tudor laundry methods were brutal, using lye soap and boiling water, which shredded delicate fabrics. So instead, Elizabeth's dresses were brushed, beaten, and perfumed. Any stains were covered with embroidery or extra jewels. Sweat, skin oils, and food smells simply built up layer by layer. When you lean close, you don't smell lavender, you smell history clinging stubbornly to fabric. Her undergarments tell an even stranger tale. Instead of modern cotton, Elizabeth wore linen shifts, supposedly the only part of her wardrobe washed with any regularity. But even those were limited. It wasn't unusual for noble women to change shifts only once a week. Think about the heat of a candlelit palace, the stress of state meetings, and the press of 40 pounds of fabric sealing in every drop of perspiration. Yes, the Queen of England had sweaty laundry problems just like anyone else, only magnified. Quirky details abound. For example, starching her ruffs became a specialized art, and some starch was tinted yellow, blue, even pink. Historians note that her ruffs sometimes had faint hues, adding to the surreal glow of her outfits. But starch was made from wheat, which, when dampened, attracted insects. That means her collars, besides being stiff as cardboard, could sprout weevils. Imagine greeting the French ambassador while a bug crawls out of your lace. Courtly dignity suddenly feels more fragile. Another fringe tidbit: Elizabeth sometimes gifted used gowns to her ladies, a gesture meant to honor them. But secretly, some ladies dreaded it. A gown worn 10 times by the Queen might reek of stale perfume, sweat, and candle smoke. Receiving one was both thrilling and slightly repulsive, like inheriting a celebrity's red carpet outfit straight from the after-party, and the shoes, those tiny, delicate slippers. They looked dainty in portraits, but wearing them was agony. No cushioned insoles, just stiff leather and thin soles, forcing Elizabeth to totter on marble floors. Combine that with gout or bunions rumored in royal circles, and her footwear was less Cinderella and more torture device. Historians debate whether Elizabeth tolerated these discomforts with stoic endurance or whether she complained endlessly in private. Some letters hint at her grumbling about stiff gowns and uncomfortable collars. But in public, she bore it as if it were divine armor. Here's your small laugh. Picture Elizabeth, after a long ceremony, shuffling back to her rooms, muttering off with this cursed ruff and flinging it across the chamber like you'd toss off socks after work. Suddenly, the queenly aura dissolves into a very human relief. But there's a darker side. The heavy, unwashed fabrics carried not just smells, but health risks. Fleas and lice could nest in the seams, and without proper washing, bacteria thrived. You can almost sense the faint itch beneath her jeweled sleeves, the hidden reality beneath the polished image. Her wardrobe was theater. Yes, but it was also prison. She couldn't be seen in plain comfort without risking whispers of decline. Each day, she dressed in layers of discomfort to convince the world she was more than mortal. Each gown was both costume and cage as you step back from the towering wardrobe. The fabric seems to whisper secrets. Beneath the pearls and brocade, beneath the dazzling image, lived a body trapped in sweat, itch, and suffocating fabric. The clothing dazzled her subjects, but for Elizabeth, every stitch carried the quiet weight of exhaustion. You drift further into the Queen's world, and now your attention lands on the little wooden chest near her bed. When it's opened, you half expect to see fragrant soaps and sparkling bath salts. Instead, the chest holds blocks of soap so rough they look more like stones than anything cleansing. Elizabeth I famously disliked bathing. The official line goes that she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Historians still argue whether that phrase was a joke or an actual record. But either way, the Queen's personal hygiene schedule was a little sparse by today's standards. Imagine an entire month passing, and your only solution to body odor is spritzing perfumes, changing linen, and dusting yourself in powders. But here's the catch: you might think monthly baths were unusual. They weren't. Most of Tudor England treated water with suspicion. Rivers and wells were breeding grounds for disease, and physicians of the day insisted that hot baths opened the pores, making you vulnerable to miasmas or bad air that carried sickness. In other words, your royal doctor might advise, "Please, Your Majesty, don't wash too much. It will weaken your body." So Elizabeth wasn't slacking, she was following medical advice. When she did bathe, it was a production. A wooden tub, lined with cloth, was set in her chamber, filled with warmed water infused with herbs like rosemary or thyme. Attendants poured jug after jug, while perfumed oils were added. The Queen lowered herself into the bath, fully assisted, modesty carefully maintained, with sheets held above the water. You imagine her sighing in rare relief as steam curled upward, the first true clean in weeks. Then you realize the tub was emptied bucket by bucket, hauled away by servants. If you ever felt bad about cleaning your own bathroom, spare a thought for the poor soul carrying 20 gallons of Elizabeth's bathwater down the palace stairs. But day to day, she avoided baths. Instead, Elizabeth relied on perfumes, pomanders, and scented gloves. Her leather gloves were steeped in ambergris or civet luxuries meant to mask any human smell. The gloves themselves became so fragrant that when she waved her hand, a cloud of scent followed her. It was impressive, but also slightly desperate, like someone drowning themselves in body spray after skipping gym showers. There's a quirky tidbit here. She also owned pomander hollow balls filled with herbs, resins, and spices. These were carried or worn around the neck, believed to ward off both disease and bad smells. Historians note that Elizabeth particularly favored ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales. Yes, you heard that right. The Queen of England carried whale gut perfume to smell pleasant at court. Now, cleanliness wasn't just about skin. Teeth mattered, too, or at least they were supposed to. Elizabeth had a notorious sweet tooth. She adored candied violets, marzipan, and sugar-dusted fruit. Sugar was a luxury at the time, so indulging was a royal privilege. But the consequence was disastrous. By middle age, her teeth had blackened and rotted. Ambassadors even wrote home about the sight of the Queen's decaying smile. Imagine the French court gossiping, Her Majesty's gown dazzles, but her teeth less so. And yet, Elizabeth still tried to maintain appearances. She owned rudimentary toothbrushes, wooden sticks with cloth or horsehair bristles, and powders made from ground salt, charcoal, and occasionally pumice. Some recipes even included honey, which, ironically, fed the very tooth decay she was trying to fight. Scrubbing her teeth probably did more harm than good. Historians still debate how many teeth she actually lost, but reports near the end of her life suggest she had difficulty eating solid foods. Here's a funny image. Elizabeth trying to maintain her regal poise while discreetly working a toothpick between her teeth at the dinner table. Court dinners lasted hours, with endless courses of meat and pies, without floss. You can imagine the royal annoyance of a stubborn venison shred lodged between molars. Her mouth troubles weren't just cosmetic. By her later years, chronic toothaches plagued her, and she even refused dental surgery because she feared the pain. One story claims a bishop offered to have a tooth pulled in her presence to prove it was tolerable. Whether true or not, it captures the desperation her courtiers felt about her rotting smile. So what you see in portrait's smooth, pale face, shimmering gown, glowing jewels is partly illusion. Behind the painted mask, the Queen's hygiene was uneven, rare baths, rotting teeth, heavy perfumes, sweat-drenched gowns. It was the contradiction of Tudor life, majestic in image, messy in reality, and that monthly bath. You can almost picture it now. Elizabeth stepping into steaming rosemary water, attendants whispering respectfully, while in the background her gowns hung unwashed. Her teeth ached, and the perfume on her gloves barely covered the deeper truth. Cleanliness was a dream glimpsed occasionally, then hidden beneath powders and scent. You wander a little deeper into the palace corridors, and the smell alone tells you that you're entering an era without minty fresh mornings or lavender-scented evenings. People often imagine the Tudor court as pristine halls of velvet and jewels, but in truth, daily hygiene was a constant tug-of-war between appearances and the reality of limited resources. And no place revealed this more than the way Queen Elizabeth cared for her face and hair. Let's start with her hair. Elizabeth's famous red gold locks, often displayed in portraits flowing like a fiery halo, weren't always her own. By the time she reached her 30s, stress and illness had thinned her natural hair. The answer? Wigs. Lots of wigs. Contemporary accounts suggest she owned more than 80. Each wig was carefully styled, curled, and dusted with starch or powder to keep it in shape. You might imagine a glamorous collection, except hygiene didn't exactly keep up. Wigs were rarely washed, often just dusted with powders or brushed. Lice easily transferred from scalp to wig and back again. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth herself struggled with head lice, but given the time period, the odds are high. Now, wigs weren't just about fashion. They were also a cover-up. Losing hair could be read as a sign of weakness or poor health, and Elizabeth worked tirelessly to maintain her image as the eternal virgin, queen unchanging, youthful, invincible. The wigs became a kind of armor. each one adding another layer to the performance of royalty. But beneath them, her scalp probably itched more than you'd want to think about. Then there's the matter of her skin. In portraits, Elizabeth glows, with porcelain white cheeks, smooth and unblemished. The secret wasn't flawless genes, it was cosmetics. Her weapon of choice, Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead mixed with vinegar. The effect was stunning, an opaque, pale mask that hid scars, spots, and discoloration. The danger? Lead poisoning. Prolonged use caused hair loss, tooth decay, and skin damage. Historians debate how much her health suffered because of this, but the evidence leans grimly toward the obvious. Covering her imperfections likely worsened them. Imagine Elizabeth sitting before a mirror, her ladies carefully spreading a thick layer of ceruse across her cheeks, smoothing it until she resembled a marble statue. Then rouge was dabbed on her lips, sometimes brightened with crushed cochineal insects. Yes, insect dye. Your bedtime beauty routine has nothing on Tudor innovation. The final touch. A sprinkle of powdered starch on her wig to keep it full and bright. To modern eyes, she would look dazzling under candlelight. But if you leaned close enough, you'd smell vinegar, powder, the faint tang of something metallic. There's a quirky tidbit here. Elizabeth also dabbled in egg white masks. These were literally smoothed raw egg whites painted onto the skin, which dried into a stiff layer that pulled the face taut, creating a temporary, youthful lift. If you've ever cracked an egg and felt that slimy texture slide through your fingers, now picture that being slathered on your cheeks in a chilly Tudor bedroom. Talk about a royal spa day. Yet, the obsession with pallor went deeper than vanity. Pale skin was a sign of nobility, proof that you didn't labor in the sun like peasants. The whiter your complexion, the higher your perceived status. Elizabeth took this to extremes, cultivating a look so pale she was compared to the moon itself. But the irony was cruel. The very cosmetics that gave her this ethereal glow were eating away at her health. Historians still argue whether her later illnesses like persistent headaches and fatigue were worsened by decades of smearing poison onto her face. Meanwhile, hair hygiene brought its own battles. Hair was washed rarely, maybe once every few weeks, and more often combed with fine-toothed combs to catch lice. Instead of shampoo, people rubbed rosemary or lavender oils into the scalp. Elizabeth likely enjoyed perfumed oils, but these were more about fragrance than true cleaning. And if wigs carried lice, combing alone wouldn't stop the cycle. Imagine the court's horror if anyone spotted the Virgin Queen scratching beneath her golden curls. Even teeth entered into the beauty equation here. Remember that sweet tooth we talked about? The darker her teeth grew, the more she leaned on cosmetic tricks. It was even said that ladies of her court sometimes blackened their own teeth to imitate the queen. Because if Elizabeth had them, then rotting teeth must be fashionable. You can almost picture a courtier, lips painted crimson, smiling wide, to show deliberately darkened molars. Hoping to win favor, another fun but strange note. Elizabeth sometimes used false hairpieces, not just for her head, but for eyebrows. Thin, pale brows were trendy, so she plucked her natural ones and then pasted on false arcs made of mouse fur. Yes, mouse fur. Imagine little tufts glued carefully above her eyes, giving her that sharp, regal expression. It's hard not to chuckle today. People spend hours perfecting their brows with pencils and gels. But Elizabeth may have solved it with, well, rodent clippings. So here's the contrast. By torchlight, Elizabeth looked divine, luminous skin, fiery hair, radiant eyes. But peel back the layers, and you find wigs hiding baldness, powders hiding blemishes, lead slowly poisoning the body, and brows glued on from tiny creatures you'd normally avoid in your pantry. It's a delicate balancing act you're watching unfold, the Queen's endless war between appearance and decay. She needed to project eternal youth, yet every remedy she applied dragged her closer to frailty. You can almost feel her frustration: scratchy wigs, sticky lead paste, itchy scalpend, yet she endured it all for the sake of her image. And in the candlelit court, as music swelled and courtiers bowed, no one dared question whether the queen's beauty was natural. You step into the dining hall, and immediately the contrast between grandeur and grime hits you. The tables gleam with silver platters, golden goblets, and richly embroidered cloths. The queen dines beneath tapestries that tell stories of conquest and glory, while musicians play to honor her majesty. But lean a little closer, bend your nose toward the food, the air, the floor, and the illusion begins to crack. The Tudors loved meat. Venison, beef, pork, mutton, swan, goose. If it walked, flew, or swam, it likely ended up roasted or stewed on Elizabeth's table. Meals at court were massive feasts, with dozens of courses arriving one after another. To the modern eye, it looks indulgent, extravagant, almost godlike. But preservation methods were primitive. Meat was often salted, dried, or smoked, and if fresh, it was slaughtered and cooked quickly. Refrigeration? Forget it. Spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon weren't just for flavor. They masked the taste of food that was starting to return. Imagine lifting a golden platter and realizing the roast smells faintly of something wrong, but then taking a bite anyway because it's soaked in sauce and spice. And then the bread, called trencher bread. These were thick slices used as edible plates. Food piled on top would soak into them, and by the end of the meal, they were either eaten or tossed to the poor waiting outside. Practical, yes, but by the end of a banquet, you'd find piles of soggy, greasy trenchers dumped onto the rushes on the floor, mingling with other scraps. Speaking of rushes, the floor itself was a chaos of filth. Instead of bare wood, halls were covered with straw or rushes meant to absorb spills. But in practice, these mats became compost heaps. Food scraps, grease, spit, bones, even chamber pot contents sometimes ended up there. Imagine rats darting out from beneath the queen's dais, bold enough to snatch a chicken bone while courtiers pretended not to notice. And fleas thrived in this mess, leaping onto gowns, leggings, or even nibbling ankles under the table. Now, the tableware glittered, but hygiene was questionable. Forks were not common in England until much later, so people mostly used knives, spoons, and their fingers. You'd wipe your greasy hands on the same napkin used by the person beside you. If you were lucky, it was linen. If not, it was your sleeve. Water bowls for rinsing fingers were sometimes set out. But think of a dozen courtiers dipping into the same bowl before touching their next serving. Not exactly sanitary. And then there were the vermin. Rats weren't the only intruders. You'd also spot flies buzzing over the roast, or a beetle crawling across the trenchers. Dogs sometimes roamed the halls, snapping up scraps. Elizabeth, famously fond of her small lapdogs, may have let them wander near her while dining. It's easy to imagine one darting under the tablecloth, licking grease from a discarded trencher, while courtiers nervously pretended this was perfectly fine. Now picture the queen herself. She had a notoriously sweet tooth, so sugar often appeared. At meals, candied fruits, spiced cakes, and elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties decorated the table. These weren't just desserts, they were works of art shaped into castles, animals, even entire scenes from mythology. All carved from sugar. They dazzled the eye but destroyed the teeth. You already know the results. Elizabeth's smile darkened. But her love of sugar never wavered. There's another oddity. Ale and wine flowed more freely than water. Drinking water was often unsafe, drawn from sources easily contaminated with waste. So everyone drank small beer a week, ale, or diluted wine. Even children. At feasts, goblets of rich red wine kept arriving, and while the queen was moderate, Many courtiers staggered out of banquets, flushed and boisterous. The smell of alcohol, sweat, perfume, and food scraps thickened the air until you might long for a breath of clean night breeze. Etiquette, however, tried to hold chaos at bay. There were strict rules. Don't lick your knife. Don't put bones back on the platter. Don't talk with your mouth full. Yet not everyone followed them. Imagine a young noble trying to impress, gnawing on a bone until grease drips down his chin, while Elizabeth's sharp eyes note his lack of refinement. By the end of a feast, the tables looked like battlefield's grease. Stains on linen, trenchers collapsing into mush, bones and scraps tossed into the rushes. Servants rushed in with basins and brooms, sweeping waste into piles, but the smell lingered. Add the faint scuttle of rats and the buzzing of flies, and you begin to wonder how long anyone could actually sit comfortably at these banquets. And yet, to foreign ambassadors and visitors, the spectacle dazzled. They saw glittering plate, fine wines, endless courses, and a queen radiant in her jewels. They rarely wrote about the fleas biting their ankles or the sour tank of spoiled meat. Like Elizabeth herself, the Tudor feast was an illusion of polished mask, hiding decay. It's worth noting that Elizabeth was shrewd about how food shaped her image. She made sure her feasts looked abundant, proving England's prosperity. Even if the reality behind the smell was less than royal, the performance was convincing, much like her wigs and makeup. The dining table was another stage where image triumphed over truth. So, as you sit in this great hall, your senses overwhelmed by both luxury and filth. You realize dining with Elizabeth was less about taste and more about theater. You ate with your eyes, dazzled by abundance, even as the rats dined with you. You drift closer to Elizabeth's throne during an audience, and what strikes you isn't her crown, nor her jewels, it's her teeth. Blackened, uneven, decaying. For a woman who embodied majesty, it was an odd flaw, and yet it told a story about both her life and her kingdom. Sugar had become the ultimate status symbol in Tudor England. Imported from the colonies at staggering prices, it was rarer than gold in the eyes of many courtiers. To consume sugar meant to flaunt wealth, refinement, and sophistication. Elizabeth adored it. Dishes laced with sugar appeared constantly on her table: canned violets, marzipan figures, sweet wines, fruit preserves, gingerbread, cakes, even meats glazed with sugar crusts. She didn't just nibble, she devoured. And slowly her smile became her most dangerous indulgence by her later years. Elizabeth's teeth were so decayed that foreign ambassadors noted them with a mix of pity and revulsion. Reports describe her gums swollen, her teeth black, and her speech occasionally difficult to understand. Imagine leaning close during a royal whisper and smelling the sour sweetness of decay, or watching her try to flash a regal grin while hiding the pain gnawing in her jaw. Her courtiers, desperate to imitate their queen, followed suit. Nobles who could afford sugar consumed it lavishly, and soon blackened teeth themselves became a bizarre mark of status. If your smile rotted, it meant you could afford the luxury that caused it. In fact, there are accounts of poorer women staining their teeth artificially black just to mimic the aristocracy. In other words, rotting teeth weren't just tolerated, they were fashionable. Elizabeth, however, did not escape the agony behind the fashion. Dentistry in the 16th century was crude, more butchery than medicine. Toothaches were treated with poultices of herbs, vinegar rinses, or even opium and laudanum for pain. Extraction was the last resort, done without anesthesia by barber surgeons using iron pliers. The queen reportedly allowed very few teeth to be pulled, terrified of the pain. In one infamous story, she supposedly had a bishop's tooth pulled before her to watch his suffering before refusing to endure it herself. Whether legend or truth, it reveals her fear of medical intervention. As her dental health worsened, so did the rumors. courtiers whispered about the queen's breath. Foreign ambassadors wrote bluntly about her foul mouth, noting that she often spoke with difficulty. Yet no one dared mock her openly. Elizabeth was still the virgin queen, the radiant monarch, the ruler whose words carried weight across Europe. To insult her was to insult England. And so, silence reigned even as her smile blackened. The irony is sharp. Her love of sugar was also political. By consuming the sweet commodity in great quantities, Elizabeth showcased England's trade wealth. Sugar symbolized power, empire, and connection to the wider world. Every candied rose petal she ate was a quiet proclamation of dominance, even if it rotted her from the inside. Picture this contradiction. A queen clad in jewels worth kingdoms, her golden wig shining beneath candlelight, her gown stiff with pearls and when she smiles, it reveals teeth as black as coal. Foreign dignitaries record the image with horror, but back home, it becomes a kind of twisted fashion statement. And yet, Elizabeth weaponized even this flaw. She had long mastered the art of turning weakness into spectacle. She may have smiled less openly in later years, but when she did, it was still deliberate, still powerful. Her courtiers mirrored her every gesture, even down to embracing the same decay. Here, you sense the strange beauty of her court, a world where rot itself became regal, and where the queen's mouth was both her greatest shame and a symbol of taptas, of her kingdom's wealth. Her teeth tell a story far larger than her smile. They reveal a monarchy that turned even decay into theater. You follow Elizabeth into her private apartments, the velvet curtains drawn against the chill, the air perfumed with roses, but the closer you look, the more you realize it's not really roses you're smelling. Beneath the surface lies something far less enchanting. Elizabeth was legendary for her elaborate cosmetics, and while her courtiers raved about her dazzling white complexion, the secret recipe behind that glow was pure poison. She used Venetian ceruse, a heavy white paste made of lead carbonate and vinegar. Applied thickly to her face, it created a ghostly, smooth mask that covered blemishes, scars, and the natural signs of aging. In candlelight, she gleamed like alabaster, flawless and ethereal. But behind the mask, her skin suffered. The lead corroded, inflamed, and aged her complexion more quickly, so that she applied more and more layers to conceal the damage. The cycle was vicious, yet she clung to the image of eternal youth. Now imagine the texture up close. Her skin coated so thickly it cracked when she smiled. The ceruse mixed with sweat, creating streaks of chalky residue. At times, her attendants had to peel it away with cloths soaked in milk or urine, a grotesque nightly ritual. And when she reapplied, she added vermilion, a mercury-based pigment, for blush on her cheeks and lips, doubling the dose of toxicity. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth herself realized the danger. Some claim she knew, but considered beauty a political weapon too valuable to abandon. Others suggest the medical understanding of the time was so poor that she genuinely believed the cosmetics were safe. What's certain is that prolonged exposure to lead caused hair loss, tooth decay, trembling hands, and skin ulcers. Many scholars believe the queen's later health issues, her thinning hair, her rotting teeth, her reliance on wigs were direct consequences of this toxic beauty regimen, and the wigs themselves became essential props. Elizabeth lost much of her natural hair, so she wore elaborate auburn wigs styled into towering constructions. They were symbols of her control, her majesty, her refusal to show weakness. Yet beneath them, her scalp may have been raw and scarred from years of lead paste. You picture her attendants carefully positioning a wig, not daring to mention the sores beneath. The strangest part, her courtiers eagerly copied her. Both men and women at court slathered themselves in lead paint to mimic her pale skin, which was associated with nobility. Tanned complexions were for peasants laboring under the sun. Whiteness meant you lived in luxury. So, as Elizabeth's face silently poisoned her, her court followed like moths to flame, destroying their own skin in the process. It became a kingdom of painted ghosts. Occasionally, foreign ambassadors commented on the eerie look. They described Elizabeth's face as mask-like, her movements stiff, her cheeks unnaturally red. But to her subjects, she remained glorious. Her image on portraits, always idealized, always youthful, cemented the illusion. Pain, poison, and decay were brushed aside in favor of majesty. And then there's the myth of her mask of youth. In her later years, Elizabeth was desperate to appear ageless. Forever the radiant Virgin Queen, she reportedly wore layers of white paint, so thick that removing them risked tearing skin from her face. Some claim that toward the end of her reign, she even slept with her cosmetics still on, unwilling to let anyone, even her closest lady, see the reality underneath. Whether true or exaggerated, the myth itself reveals how central the painted mask was to her identity. Now imagine yourself watching her enter the Great Hall, bathed in candlelight. The pearls on her gown shimmer, the red jewels gleam like embers, and her face is a flawless sheet of white marble. She smiles stiffly, the cracks carefully hidden under powder, her lips a sharp streak of vermilion. The courtiers gasp in awe, unaware, perhaps unwilling to care, that beneath that perfection lurks corrosion, sores, and poison. Elizabeth transformed her very body into theater, sacrificing health for image, and in doing so, set the tone for her entire court. The irony is cruel. The most powerful woman in Europe was slowly undone by the very mask that made her unforgettable. You drift with Elizabeth from the painted mask of cosmetics into the next layer of royal theater, her clothing. You think the face paint was heavy? Wait until you step into her wardrobe. The Elizabethan fashion sense was as impractical as it was dazzling, a strange marriage of spectacle and suffering. And Elizabeth, the epicenter of the trend, pushed it to its limits. Her gowns were enormous constructions. Imagine standing inside a cage of whalebone or metal hoops, called a farthingale, that spread your skirt into a rigid dome. Add a padded roll at the waist to exaggerate your hips, lace that squeezes your ribs until breathing is shallow and stiffened, collars that rise like a fortress behind your head. Every movement became a performance. Sitting required perching carefully on the edge of a chair. Walking meant shuffling sideways through doorways. Going to the bathroom, well, you don't even want to picture that. Yet Elizabeth insisted on towering collars, massive sleeves, and yards of embroidered fabric. Even in the stifling summers, the hygiene nightmare came from what lay beneath. The layers of linen, chemises, and petticoats rarely saw a wash, since laundering fine fabrics was time-consuming and rough on the delicate materials. Instead, garments absorbed sweat, perfume, and skin oils until they became stiff. Attendants sprinkled them with powders and herbs to mask the smell. One quirky detail: some courtiers even stitched pockets of dried lavender into their underlayers to disguise the funk. Still, in a crowded court, the air was thick with musk. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly endured the discomfort or whether her tailors devised clever tricks to lighten the load. Some suggest her farthingales were less restrictive than the popular caricatures imply. Others argue she embraced the full weight, believing that a queen must literally embody majesty, even if it meant waddling like a ship under sail. What's beyond debate is that her wardrobe choices reshaped English fashion, setting trends that trickled down even if commoners copied them in cheaper, rougher fabrics. Then there were the shoes. Platform chapines, sometimes inches high, forced an awkward, tottering gait. Elizabeth occasionally wore silk slippers, but her courtiers teetered on wooden-soled shoes designed less for comfort than for showing status. Now imagine the scuffed, unwashed stockings beneath, softened with sweat. Never quite clean because soap was a precious commodity. And let's not forget the ruffs. The great starched collars that framed her face like a halo. Maintaining those things was an ordeal. They had to be starched with a paste made from wheat flour or even old beer, then pressed with hot irons. The starch stiffened, but also trapped grime, and if the mixture soured, the smell followed the wearer. Like a faint bakery gone bad. Elizabeth's ruffs were sometimes so wide that eating became a comedy of manners. Food had to be cut and fed delicately, or else risk smearing sauce across the starched folds. You imagine the queen leaning forward, servants carefully maneuvering a dish past the lace walls around her neck. But why did she do it? Because appearance was armor. Elizabeth's clothes were weapons of awe. Draped in pearls and cloth of gold, she transformed herself into a living symbol of the nation. Each gown was not just fabric, but propaganda stitched with allegory and wealth. She projected purity, power, and magnificence even if underneath, her body itched, sweated, and sagged under the weight. One fringe tidbit. There's a rumor that some gowns were so loaded with jewels that they required multiple servants just to carry them into place. If you stood near her, you'd hear the faint clinking of gems and metalwork every time she shifted. Like a human chandelier, she shimmered but also probably rattled slightly with each breath. And yet, despite the extravagance, her wardrobe was reworn again and again. These weren't disposable costumes, but investments. When dresses grew stale, they were altered, trimmed, or gifted. But the layers of starch, sweat, and perfume never truly left. Imagine the queen leaning on her ladies in, waiting, whispering for them to adjust a corset string or shift a wig to ease the ache. She could never publicly show discomfort. Her majesty was seamless. Only behind the velvet curtains did the seams crack. You can't help but laugh softly to yourself. Here was the most powerful woman in Europe, leading an empire across oceans, but trapped inside dresses so impractical she couldn't scratch her own ankle. Royal fashion may have projected divine authority, but it also meant being, quite literally, sewn into your image. By now, you've wandered through the sticky makeup, the half-washed clothes, the powdered wigs, and the perfumed gowns. But pause and take a deep breath. Actually, don't. Because if you were standing anywhere near Elizabeth's court, the smell would have been overwhelming. Hygiene and odor were inseparable in her world, and both were disasters wrapped in roses. Let's start with the palace itself. Picture the grand halls of Whitehall or Hampton Court, draped in tapestries, filled with courtiers, and glittering with candlelight. Elegant at a glance, yes, but beneath the splendor lurked stench. Fireplaces smoked, rushes on the floor collected crumbs, grease, and even the occasional mouse droppings and chamber pots spilled over with the day's business. Attendants might scatter dried herbs or strew flowers to mask the odor, but it was like throwing a handful of potpourri into a landfill. You caught the sweetness for a moment. Then the sourness underneath slapped back harder. Elizabeth herself tried to rise above it with perfumes. Her chambers were filled with pomander solospheres stuffed with spices and scented wax. She carried them, tucked them in gowns, or hung them nearby. Musk, rosewater, and civet, which, fun fact, comes from the gland of a small cat-like animal, were common. But too much perfume just created a fog, cloying and thick, so that courtiers complained the air felt syrupy. Historians still argue whether her reliance on heavy scents was about masking poor hygiene or signaling wealth, since only the rich could afford constant supplies of exotic ingredients. Maybe it was both an aromatic defense shield and a brag. Rolled into one, her breath was another matter. Chronic tooth decay left Elizabeth with blackened teeth, and by the later years, foul breath. Foreign ambassadors wrote about it, not always kindly. One quirky tidbit: Some whispered she stuffed cloves between her gums to freshen her breath before audiences. Imagine trying to hold a stately conversation while crunching on cloves, praying they last long enough to cover the rot. You'd lean close to her in counsel, only to be met by the mingling of sweet spice and sour decay. And yet her courtiers mirrored her. Baths were rare, washing was light, so everyone smelled. Layers of wool, velvet, and fur-trapped sweat. In winter, dampness added mildew to the bouquet. If you visited the Queen's presence chamber, you'd walk into a wall of human musk, topped with incense and perfumes burning in brass braziers. One French visitor joked that the English preferred to marinate in their odors rather than banish them. That's not entirely fair, but you can almost see the point. Then came the food odors. Elizabeth loved banquet-spiced meats, fish, pies, and sweets. Imagine the greasy aroma of roasted swan or venison mingling with perfume and unwashed. Bodies add spilled ale, souring wine, and the dribble of sauces across table rushes. By midnight, the hall reeked like a carnival of decay. Servants would sweep herbs across the floor to cover the stench, but the mix only created new, layered smells. What about her own body scent? Historians speculate endlessly. Without daily bathing, she likely relied on cloths soaked in rosewater to wipe down. But perfume can only hide so much. Even the Queen's sweat had to be endured. Courtiers were trained to stand close without wrinkling noses, just as today you might stand politely in an elevator next to someone who forgot deodorant. Except here, the elevator was permanent. One fringed tale suggests Elizabeth sometimes slept with scented gloves on, so that when she raised her hands near her face, the lavender or ambergris soothed her. Gloves themselves became soaked with perfumes until they were as stiff as cardboard. Imagine lying down, pressing perfumed gloves to your nose, and hoping they block the reality. You can't help but joke quietly to yourself. Elizabeth's court wasn't a palace of roses, was a giant scented candle factory trying to disguise a dumpster fire. Yet people grew used to it. Odor was part of life. Just as you stopped noticing background traffic noise, they learned to exist in the haze. Only newcomers gagged at first thought. Still, for Elizabeth, every whiff was political. Her perfumes were declarations of sophistication, her ability to mask odor a symbol of refinement. She turned stench into spectacle, using it as another thread in the tapestry of her royal image. And so, you find yourself marveling not at how disgusting it all was, but at how she wielded even foul air as a weapon of majesty. You've tiptoed past the perfumes, the chamber pots, and the endless stench, but now you step closer into Elizabeth's private world. And notice the silences she carried about her own body. Because here's the awkward truth. The Queen was not immune to natural human problems, even if everyone pretended otherwise. Let's start with the less glamorous side of royal life: digestion. Elizabeth's diet was famously rich in meats and sweets, from roasted game to sugary marzipan. Fiber, not so much. Historians still argue whether her frequent stomach complaints were simply the result of overindulgence or the signs of something more chronic, like ulcers. Either way, she often dealt with bloating, constipation, and the kind of indigestion that makes you burp in the middle of a solemn meeting. One quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest she chewed mastic gum, an ancient resin thought to freshen the breath and calm the stomach. Imagine sitting on your throne, discreetly chewing away, while trying to look regal. Then there's the problem of menstrual cycles. Royal propaganda tried to erase this from view, but Elizabeth's body followed the same rhythms as any other woman's. Without modern sanitary products, she would have relied on cloth, rags washed, reused, and often difficult to clean properly. Historians whisper that attendants discreetly carried bundles of linen in and out of her chambers, but details were never recorded openly. Whether she suffered from cramps or irregular cycles is debated, yet there's no question it shaped her. Moods, energy, and even the scheduling of court events. The reality was hidden, but it hung in the air, like the scent of lavender masking something stronger. Sweat was another enemy. Heavy gowns layered with farthingales, corsets, and furs trapped heat until Elizabeth sweltered beneath them. Remember? This was before deodorants, so perspiration soaked her chemises and shifted into a sourness even perfumes couldn't entirely erase. Courtiers murmured that she sometimes kept windows open even in chilly weather, craving fresh air, while others shivered. You, standing at the edge of the chamber, would notice the faint mix of roses and human salt. It was a smell of power, but also of plain mortality. And let's talk skin. Makeup clogged her pores, wigs irritated her scalp, and without proper cleansing, rashes or boils weren't uncommon. One anecdote describes her scratching furiously beneath her wig, revealing patches of irritated skin. Was it lice? Was it eczema? Historians still argue. Either way, it wasn't the smooth, untouchable image the portraits promised. A fringe rumor even claimed she kept scratching posts' wooden sticks with padded tips to rub her back against. In private, whether true or not, you can picture her, crowned and robed, awkwardly leaning against a post, sighing in relief. Turd teeth, too, were both a visible and invisible burden. We've already brushed against the decay, but imagine the pain, abscesses, swelling, throbbing nerves. Dental tools of the era were terrifying iron forceps and no anesthesia. Elizabeth dreaded dentists so much that she endured agony rather than face extractions, and so her discomfort became part of her daily presence. If you stood close enough, you'd see her wince slightly when sipping wine or chewing carefully. One side of her jaw avoided. None of this was spoken of aloud, of course. To her court, Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen, untouchable, divine, almost beyond flesh. To acknowledge her sweat, cramps, or stomach troubles would have been treasonous gossip. But within her chambers, the reality lingered. Servants scrubbed cloths, changed linens, carried perfumes, and pretended not to notice. The silence was almost ritual, and yet it humanizes her. You picture her, sitting alone after a feast, clutching her stomach, groaning quietly, and wishing she hadn't eaten that last slice of spiced pie. You imagine her attendants soothing her with rosewater cloths during a cycle, or her slipping cloves between her teeth, hoping no one noticed the ache behind her smile. The queen who terrified her enemies and commanded armies was also the queen who dealt with sweat stains, foul breath, and constipation. In that contrast lies the fascination. She was myth on the outside, discomfort on the inside. And the deeper you lean into her private world, the more you sense how much effort went into keeping the myth alive day after day, while her body reminded her she was as fragile as anyone else. You drift even deeper into Elizabeth's chambers, and here, the air grows heavier with the invisible troubles of the queen's body. The ailments that never made it into official proclamations, but lingered in whispers. Her physicians recorded only in vague Latin, careful never to offend, but their treatments reveal more than they intended. One of the most pressing issues was Elizabeth's headaches. Some said they came from stress, others blamed her towering wigs or the lead makeup she wore daily. Imagine balancing a headpiece that weighed nearly as much as a small cat while trying to debate with ambassadors about war strategy. Historians still argue whether her headaches were simple migraines or something more sinister, perhaps tied to mercury poisoning. Either way, she often shut herself away. Lights dimmed, attendants creeping silently to avoid making noise. Her circulation wasn't kind either. Without modern understanding, she spent long hours sitting, issuing commands, signing documents, attending ceremonies. Swollen legs, aching joints, and occasional fainting spells weren't unusual. A quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest she used slices of cucumber or damp cloths on her legs to reduce swelling. Surprisingly spa-like image for someone ruling an empire. You can almost picture her attendants gently pressing cool cloths too. Her ankles, pretending it was all part of regal decorum. Then there's the problem of infections. Elizabeth lived in an age where antibiotics didn't exist, and even a small cut could fester into something serious. Servants and courtiers constantly feared carrying illnesses into her presence, but the queen herself wasn't immune. Smallpox struck her in 1562, leaving faint scars across her face. Historians whisper that heavy makeup afterward wasn't just a beauty choice, was camouflage. Underneath the thick white paint, her skin carried reminders of her near-death brush with disease, but digestion returned often as a tormentor. The feasts of roasted swans, eels, and sugar sculptures thrilled her court but did not thrill her intestines. Chronic constipation was more than a nuisance, it was a political liability. Picture her, forced to sit through hours-long councils. Her stomach gurgling, her face frozen in regal calm, while inside, she wished for nothing more than a private chamber pot. Treatments included purgatives made of rhubarb, senna, or even powdered antimony. One fringe recipe called for swallowing a live spider wrapped in butter. Historians still argue whether she ever tried that one. But you can imagine the hush in the room if she had. Dental misery continued to shadow her. We've already brushed across her decaying teeth, but by her later years, pain became a constant companion. Rumors spread of foul breath, so strong courtiers tried to keep a polite distance. Yet even through the discomfort, she insisted on public appearances. Imagine her smiling stiffly through throbbing abscesses, the whole court pretending not to notice. It's almost admirable, almost tragic, and definitely uncomfortable to think about. And then there was her horror, rather, the wigs that replaced it. Lice infestations were common across all classes, and even royal scalps were not spared. Her wigs became both armor and prison, hiding thinning hair but also trapping heat and itching against her skin. A quirky rumor claimed she sometimes had her attendants rub her scalp with vinegar to chase away pests. Did it work? Historians still argue. But the idea of vinegar-scented wigs drifting through the great halls is hard to shake. Insomnia, too, became one of her invisible burdens. Court records note her working late into the night, restless, pacing, dictating letters, or summoning musicians to soothe her. Without modern sleep aids, she relied on herbal remedies, chamomile, valerian, or warm ale spiced with cloves. Yet even with such comforts, the stress of ruling left her awake, her body weary, but her mind refusing to quiet. You imagine her lying in a darkened chamber, listening to the hum of the court outside, the flicker of candlelight painting shadows on the ceiling, wondering how much longer her body could keep up the performance. Her body was always both her tool and her betrayal. She had to appear powerful, untouchable, divine, yet every ache, every rash, every sleepless night tugged her back to the truth. She wasn't immortal. She was a woman, stitched together from perfumes, cloths, wigs, and sheer stubbornness, struggling to keep the illusion of majesty intact while her body whispered its protests louder each year. And the more you see it, the more haunting it becomes. Elizabeth Smith was polished and gilded, but beneath the surface, she carried the same unglamorous pains you do. Her throne was a hard chair, her crown was a headache, and her stomach was often a battlefield. All hidden, all denied, but always present. You follow Elizabeth into the twilight of her reign, and hear the tone of her hygiene grows heavier, almost tragic. Age catches even a queen who tried to outpaint, outperfume, and outperform the reality of her mortal body. The older she became, the harder she clung to the masks she had built. Her teeth, by now, were nearly useless. Court gossip suggested that when she tried to chew, attendants could hear the effort across the hall. Meat had to be minced into soft pulp, fruits boiled into jams, bread dipped in ale to soften it. Imagine her stubbornly sitting with platters of roasted venison and swan, pretending to enjoy them, while secretly favoring a bowl of mush that wouldn't send her jaw screaming. Historians still argue whether she lost most of her teeth by the 1590s or if some were painfully clinging on until her last years. Either way, her smile was no longer the radiant mask painted in earlier portraits. The makeup became thicker as her skin aged. Cracks appeared in the lead foundation, requiring more layers to smooth them out. Courtiers joked privately that her face looked almost like plaster smooth at a distance, but frightening up close. One fringe tidbit says attendants sometimes had to scrape off hardened layers with cloth soaked in wine, the residue building like wax on a candle. You imagine the faint scratch of fabric across her cheeks, the sour smell of old wine clinging afterward. Her hair loss was nearly complete. The iconic red curls were long gone, replaced entirely by wigs perched precariously on her thinning scalp. Servants tightened straps under her chin to hold them in place, but sometimes, when she bowed or gestured too quickly, the wig shifted. Courtiers held their breath, praying it wouldn't topple. Some claimed that she owned more than 80 wigs, all styled in elaborate fashions to keep the illusion alive. Historians still argue whether the sheer number was true or court exaggeration. Bathing rituals, already rare, became almost non-existent in her last years. The fear of illness from water grew stronger with her frailty, and so she relied on perfumes, powders, and freshly laundered linens to hide the truth. Imagine the queen, cloaked in silks, surrounded by lavender, sachets, and rosewater, while beneath it all her skin bore the marks of age, of sweat, of a life lived in constant display. The paranoia of disease grew worse, too. Every cough in the palace felt like a threat. She demanded her chambers be fumigated with herbs juniper, rosemary, and even sulfur. The smoke filled the air, choking servants, leaving an acrid film on tapestries. Yet Elizabeth believed it warded off sickness. A quirky tidbit, she sometimes wore charms or carried amulets meant to balance her humors. Imagine a queen of empires gripping a little trinket in her palm, as if that could keep death away. Her insomnia worsened as well. Nights stretched long, her mind replaying failures and fears. Musicians were summoned to strum soft melodies, but even their songs couldn't hush the weight of age. Some nights she wandered the halls in her nightgown, her attendants trailing behind with lanterns, as if she were both ghost and queen at once. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerations or accurate glimpses of a restless monarch trapped in her own anxieties. Her refusal to admit weakness turned into ritual stubbornness. She clung to ceremony, demanding to be dressed in full regalia even when she could barely stand. Layers of velvet, ruffs, and jewels pressed against her frail frame, and still she commanded audiences. To her, giving up the image meant giving up her crown. You picture her leaning heavily on attendants, cheeks stiff with paint, breath sour with decay, yet voice still sharp enough to slice through a court of men who underestimated her by her 60s. Elizabeth's body had become an enemy she refused to acknowledge. She surrounded herself with mirrors, but ordered attendants to remove them once they showed too much truth. Rooms were darkened, shadows hiding what she didn't want to see. And yet, the kingdom still looked to her as the eternal Virgin Queen, untouchable, unchanged, even as her body betrayed her. It's haunting, isn't it? All those perfumes, powders, wigs, and gowns weren't just fashion, they were armor against time. And as you imagine her last years, you sense how fragile the illusion had become. The glamorous queen who dazzled Europe was, behind the silks, an old woman carrying the same discomforts, smells, and pains as anyone else. Only difference, she had to hide hers on a stage the size of an empire. You linger now at the very edge of Elizabeth's story, where her reign, like her body, begins to fade. The twilight years of the Virgin Queen are wrapped not only in political uncertainty, but also in the intimate humiliations of age. Her hygiene, once eccentric, now turns almost tragic, each detail whispering of a woman determined to remain a myth, even as reality gnawed at her. Elizabeth's refusal to sleep in a proper bed became one of her strangest last habits. For years, she would not rest fully lying down, preferring instead to nap in a padded chair, as if lying flat would signal surrender. Picture her in those high-ceilinged chambers, sitting upright with her wig set aside, her thin hair exposed, wrapped in heavy robes that smelled of herbs and rosewater. Around her, servants dozed on stools, the air thick with the sharp tang of burning rosemary. Historians still argue whether her chair sleeping was born from fear of death, chronic insomnia, or simply the aches of an aging body that found no peace stretched flat. Her mouth, nearly toothless, left her speech altered. Foreign ambassadors recorded that they struggled to understand her words. Imagine a queen whose tongue once commanded empires, now mumbling through hollow gums, words softened and slurred. Attendants brought her broths instead of feasts, and you can almost hear the spoon clinking against delicate silver bowls. The sound of royalty reduced to warm mush. Cosmetics grew to absurd levels. White lead paint was applied so heavily it cracked under candlelight, flaking like chalk. Beneath it, sores and scars remained hidden. Some whispered that the paint itself worsened her decline, poisoning her slowly. Quirky tidbits describe how courtiers sometimes found little flecks of white on their own sleeves after kissing her hand, as though she were shedding pieces of her mask. Historians still argue whether this poisoning was a major factor in her final illness or simply an embellishment of legend. Perfume and herbs dominated her chambers. Bowls of dried lavender, fresh roses, and clove-studded oranges sat on every table. Yet beneath the sweet haze lurked the undeniable truth. Her body, rarely washed, betrayed her. Sweat, age, and sickness lingered no matter how many sachets lined the walls. And yet, visitors still described her as majestic, for few dared pierce. The illusion as her strength waned, she resisted medical treatment. Physicians urged her to take remedies, to bleed, to purge, to sip strange concoctions. She refused, claiming she did not wish to make windows into her soul. In other words, she would not let others see her vulnerability. That stubborn pride, the same that kept her crown steady through decades of threats, now prevented her from easing her own suffering. In March of 1603, Elizabeth sat silent for hours, refusing food, refusing bed, refusing speech. Attendants described her staring at shadows on the walls, her mind far away. She clutched a finger of one of her ladies-in-waiting, squeezing tight as if tethering herself to life. No perfumes, no wigs, no silks could mask the truth anymore. The queen was slipping. When she finally passed, at age 69, she left behind not just an empire, but also an image that had been carefully, painfully, obsessively curated. The Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, and yet, in the quiet details, rotting teeth, cracked paint, the smell of herbs masking sweat, you glimpse the human beneath, a woman who feared decay yet lived with it every day. A ruler who demanded to be seen as immortal, while her body reminded her she was not. So you come to the end of her story, realizing that Elizabeth's legacy is both dazzling and disturbing. Her hygiene, if you can call it that, was never about cleanliness, was about performance. Every wig, every layer of paint, every puff of perfume was a prop in the greatest play of her life. She ruled not only with armies and politics, but with illusion. And maybe, just maybe, the most human thing about her is how desperately she tried to hold on to it Asterisk. And now, as her life closes, so too does your journey tonight. The chambers of Whitehall fade into gentle shadow. The candles, snuffed out one by one. You no longer smell the acrid perfumes or hear the scrape of wigs being adjusted. Instead, the air softens, filled with nothing more than the quiet hum of your own breathing. You let the imagery of Elizabeth's world dissolve like chalk in water. The crowded court, the whispered gossip, the endless layers of velvet and paint-all. Of it slips away, leaving you with only the calm/slow rhythm of passing time. There is no need to dwell on the cracks in her mask, no need to hold on to the sour breath of age. Instead, imagine only the quiet rustle of a gown fading into stillness. The hush of silk folding gently over stone. The Queen's long reign, with all its drama and its discomforts, has drifted into history. And here you are, resting, far from the weight of crowns, far from the burdens of illusions. The story slows, your thoughts grow softer, and your body grows heavy against the quiet. Take one last deep breath and let the tension go. Allow the weight of the past to fall behind you, just as Elizabeth finally released hers. The hum of the fan, the dim light of your room. These are your own silks, your own perfumes, enough to keep you comfortable through the night. Now let yourself drift. The story is done. The Queen is at rest. And you are too. Asterisk, sweet dreams.